June of 53 BC, 7 Roman legions stood beneath the Mesopotamian sun, while an enemy they could not catch circled them. The legionaries locked their shields into a hollow square, a moving fortress of iron, leather, discipline, and rising fear. No infantry line waited ahead. No city wall offered a fixed target. The horizon itself seemed to be attacking them. Parthian horse archers approached, released their arrows, wheeled away, and returned before Roman infantry could close the distance. Crassus believed the storm must eventually end, because every archer carried only a limited number of arrows. Then he saw the camels. They knelt safely behind the riders, loaded with bundles that replaced every arrow already fired. To break the circle, Crassus sent his son Publius forward with cavalry, archers, and thousands of Roman infantry. The Parthians fled across the plain. Publius pursued, convinced that Roman aggression had finally broken their confidence. When the Roman square disappeared behind the dust, the fleeing riders turned, and a second Parthian force closed from both sides. Before the afternoon ended, Publius was dead, and his severed head was carried back toward his father's army. The legions survived until sunset, then abandoned the field under darkness, leaving thousands of wounded men behind. They reached Carrhae, but the walls offered only a pause, not safety from the cavalry controlling every road. 2 days later, Crassus went to negotiate with the Parthian commander and died in a struggle beside the meeting place. Rome lost its commander, its standards, and an army built to defeat almost any enemy it could force into a conventional battle. At Carrhae, convention was exactly what Rome never received. The disaster was not created by one miraculous weapon or one moment of cowardice. It grew from ambition, geography, intelligence, logistics, and a commander who understood how to make Roman strength irrelevant. The richest man in Rome had purchased armies, influence, and office, but he could not purchase the victory he needed most. To understand why Marcus Crassus marched into this plain, the story must return to Rome and to the rivalry governing the Republic. Carrhae began years before the first arrow flew. Marcus Licinius Crassus had survived civil war, political purges, and the dangerous rise of men stronger than the laws around them. He accumulated property, mines, estates, enslaved labor, and financial obligations until his wealth became a political weapon. Romans later remembered him as a man for whom possession created appetite rather than satisfaction. His greatest military achievement came in 71 BC, when he crushed the revolt led by Spartacus. Yet Pompey returned from Spain in time to share the political credit and celebrate victories on a far grander stage. Pompey possessed eastern conquest. Caesar would soon possess victories in Gaul. Crassus possessed money, but no comparable legend. In 60 BC, the three men formed a private political alliance, later called the First Triumvirate. Each supplied what the others lacked: popular appeal, military prestige, financial power, and influence across the Senate. The arrangement was never friendship. It was a temporary balance among ambitions too large to operate alone. At Lucca, in 56 BC, the alliance was renewed, and its members divided access to commands and provinces. Caesar retained Gaul, Pompey received Spain through deputies, and Crassus secured the wealthy eastern province of Syria. Syria gave him legions, revenue, proximity to rich kingdoms, and a frontier beyond which military glory appeared available. Parthia had no army invading Roman territory when Crassus began preparing his expedition. The campaign was therefore presented less as urgent defense than as an opportunity for conquest. Some Roman politicians opposed the war and questioned whether his authority justified an unprovoked invasion. Ancient accounts describe ominous curses and warnings during his departure, details shaped by writers who already knew the ending. Crassus continued south, crossed the Mediterranean, and arrived in Syria with the confidence of a man accustomed to overcoming resistance. In 54 BC, he crossed the Euphrates, captured several Mesopotamian towns, and left Roman garrisons behind. The first incursion met limited resistance, encouraging the belief that Parthian power would dissolve once challenged directly. Instead of advancing immediately, he returned to Syria for the winter and prepared a larger campaign. That pause gave Parthia time to understand his intention, choose commanders, and decide where the invasion should be met. By spring, both sides were preparing for a war, but only one had built its plan around the actual battlefield. King Artavasdes of Armenia came to Crassus with thousands of cavalry and a strategically valuable offer. He advised the Romans to march north through Armenia, where hills and narrow ground would restrict Parthian horsemen. Armenia could also provide allied troops, supplies, and a friendly base closer to the Parthian royal heartland. Crassus rejected the northern route and chose the direct passage across open Mesopotamia. He wanted to support the Roman garrisons left from the previous year and advance without a long detour. Ancient writers also accuse an Arab guide called Ariamnes or Abgar in different accounts of misleading the army. The guide's exact identity and role remain uncertain because surviving narratives differ and turn defeat into a moral drama. What matters tactically is clear. The Roman army moved away from the river and deeper into open, water-poor country. The land offered few fixed positions, little concealment, and horizons across which mounted scouts could observe every movement. For infantry seeking a decisive clash, openness appeared useful. For mounted archers, it was almost ideal. Publius Crassus accompanied his father after earning a strong reputation while serving under Caesar in Gaul. He brought roughly 1,000 Gallic cavalrymen, aggressive riders accustomed to close combat and personal courage. The quaestor, Gaius Cassius, was younger than Crassus, cautious, observant, and increasingly skeptical of the chosen route. The army contained 7 legions supported by cavalry, archers, light troops, servants, animals, and a long baggage train. Ancient totals vary, but the marching force probably numbered around 40,000 people under arms. Its core was heavy infantry trained to close, hold formation, throw pila, and finish combat at sword range. The system was resilient, flexible, and brutally effective when officers could bring the enemy within reach. It still required an enemy willing, compelled, or careless enough to remain near the formation. At Zeugma, the legions crossed the Euphrates and severed the last great natural boundary behind them. Every mile beyond the river increased dependence on guides, water, scouts, and decisions already made by Crassus. Parthian king Orodes II answered the invasion by dividing the strategic problem in two. He led the main royal army north against Armenia, punishing Artavasdes and preventing Armenian support from reaching Crassus. The smaller force sent against the Romans was entrusted to a noble whom Greek and Roman writers call Surena. Surena was not yet 30, but his family ranked immediately below the royal house in wealth, prestige, and hereditary privilege. According to Plutarch, he had helped restore Orodes to the throne and commanded a formidable private following. His field army was astonishingly small beside the Roman host, about 1,000 cataphracts and 9,000 horse archers. The cataphracts were armored cavalrymen whose bodies and horses were protected by overlapping metal scales. They carried long lances built to transfer the momentum of a charging horse through a concentrated point. The horse archers wore lighter equipment, rode smaller agile mounts, and fought through repeated approach, release, and withdrawal. Their composite bows were compact enough for horseback, yet powerful enough to wound through gaps and punish exposed limbs. They could shoot while approaching, crossing a flank, or turning backward during retreat. That famous backward release made pursuit dangerous, because a fleeing enemy could continue killing the men chasing him. The two cavalry types solved opposite problems. Archers forced movement, while cataphracts destroyed formations that lost cohesion. Surena added one more element that transformed harassment into sustained destruction: a mobile reserve of ammunition. Around 1,000 camels carried bundles of arrows and moved safely behind the fighting riders. An archer who emptied his quiver could withdraw, refill it, change horses if necessary, and return to the circle. The Roman assumption that missile troops must eventually exhaust themselves had been turned into a logistical trap. Surena concealed the brilliance of his armored troops beneath coverings until the Romans were committed to the field. He also used deep drums whose sound carried through dust before the riders themselves became clear. His purpose was not simply to frighten. It was to control what the Romans saw, heard, expected, and decided. He selected a battle system perfectly matched to the plane Crassus had chosen. Roman scouts first encountered the Parthians as fast-moving shapes that struck hard and disappeared before support could arrive. The survivors returned wounded and reported that the enemy was numerous, aggressive, and unlike the scattered resistance expected. Cassius urged Crassus to pause, reconnoiter, and rest the soldiers near defensible ground. Crassus continued forward, unwilling to let hesitation spread through an army already strained by heat and uncertainty. He first considered extending the legions into a broad line that might resist encirclement across a wider front. Then he chose a hollow square, with infantry on every side, and cavalry, baggage, and commanders protected within. The formation prevented a simple flank attack and allowed the army to face threats from every direction. It also surrendered initiative, compressed thousands of men, and created an enormous target that could not catch mounted skirmishers. At first, the Parthians appeared less impressive than Ruma, their most heavily armored men still hidden beneath rough coverings. Then the coverings fell, and sunlight flashed across the metal scales of riders and horses. The drums began, producing a low, continuous thunder that seemed to come from the ground beneath the Roman ranks. Surena sent the cataphracts forward in a display of weight, speed, and disciplined alignment. The Roman wall held, and the armored riders turned away before sacrificing momentum against an unbroken barrier. That apparent success confirmed the legionaries' faith in the square, while allowing Surena to begin the real attack. Mounted archers surrounded the formation at distance and released the first coordinated storm. Roman pila and slings could punish anyone who came close, but the Parthians rarely entered their effective range. The large curved scutum protected the body from one direction, not from shafts descending across several angles at once. Men pressed together, raised shields overhead, and tried to leave no opening for the next descending arrow. Heat, dust, drumbeats, wounded horses, and the hammering of iron points turned time into something measured by volleys. Crassus held the army in place because he believed the enemy's quivers must soon become empty. Instead, riders peeled away toward the camel line, returned with full quivers, and resumed shooting without interruption. The realization passed through Roman officers slowly, then all at once. There was no natural end to the barrage. Remaining still meant attrition. Advancing meant opening the formation. Retreating across the plain exposed the same problem in reverse. Small cavalry sorties attempted to drive away nearby archers, but the riders withdrew faster than Roman horses could close. When the pursuers turned back, arrows followed them into the square. Crassus needed a stronger blow, large enough to catch the enemy and create space for the legions. He ordered Publius to attack with Gallic cavalry, allied horsemen, archers, and 8 cohorts of infantry. For Publius, the command offered a chance to replace passive suffering with the kind of aggressive action Roman training rewarded. His force surged forward, and the nearest Parthian archers immediately began to retreat. The withdrawal looked disorderly enough to invite pursuit, but remained controlled enough to preserve distance. Publius pressed on because stopping would allow the archers to reform and resume the attack on his father's square. Each minute of pursuit carried his detachment farther from the legions and deeper into a curtain of dust. Once the Roman square could no longer support him, the Parthians stopped retreating. Horse archers turned across his front, while fresh groups emerged on the flanks and sealed the route behind. Arrows struck from every direction, forcing the Roman infantry into another compressed defensive mass. Publius ordered the Gallic cavalry to charge, hoping courage and close combat could break one section of the ring. The Gauls lacked heavy armor, but ancient accounts describe them seizing lances, grappling riders, and attacking armored horses at close range. Personal bravery created moments of success without changing the geometry of encirclement. Cataphracts absorbed the charge, horse archers widened around it, and the Romans lost the space required to disengage. Publius was wounded, his horsemen shattered, and his infantry forced toward a small rise where retreat became impossible. The survivors crowded around shields and wounded animals, creating a final island of resistance above the plain. Parthian arrows continued to strike, while the cataphracts waited for exhaustion to open the formation. Every attempted movement exposed a new side, and every pause allowed fresh quivers to arrive. The Gallic horses were overheated, the infantry depleted, and the road back to Crassus completely closed. Publius could neither save his command nor carry warning through the enemy surrounding him. According to Plutarch, he chose death rather than capture and asked a companion to strike the final blow. The remaining Romans were overwhelmed, and only a small number were taken alive. Surena had destroyed the one force capable of giving the main army offensive reach. He ordered Publius's head placed on a spear and carried it toward the Roman square. The returning riders approached with music, shouting, and the terrible evidence that the pursuit had failed. Crassus recognized his son, while thousands of soldiers understood that no rescuing detachment was coming back. He tried to turn private catastrophe into public resolve, reminding the troops that Rome, not one family, was at stake. The words could not restore cavalry, remove the arrows, or change the plain surrounding them. Surena now combined pressure from horse archers with sudden cataphract charges against weakened sections. The armored riders struck, withdrew, and returned wherever casualties had thinned the shield wall. Roman discipline prevented immediate collapse, but every successful defense consumed strength that could not be replaced. The battle continued until evening, when fading light finally reduced the effectiveness of the Parthian archers. Surena pulled his riders back and announced that the Romans could have one night to mourn their commander. The pause was not mercy. It left Crassus an army too damaged to remain and too disordered to retreat cleanly. Crassus was overwhelmed by grief and shock, so Cassius and other officers organized the withdrawal toward Carrhae. The survivors moved silently after dark, abandoning wounded men whose cries revealed the retreat when Parthian scouts returned. Thousands reached the walls of Carrhae, where gates, water, and stone briefly restored the feeling of a defensible world. Ancient casualty figures vary, but a large part of the invading army had already been killed, wounded, or captured. The Romans could not remain indefinitely because Surena controlled the countryside and reinforcements were not approaching. Cassius led one body west by a separate route and eventually escaped towards Syria with a fraction of the army. Crassus followed local guides north toward rougher ground, where infantry might finally gain an advantage. Confusion, darkness, and uncertain guidance delayed the column among marshes and broken tracks. At dawn, Crassus and several thousand men remained exposed below terrain that could have protected them. Surena approached with an offer to negotiate safe withdrawal, presenting agreement as the only alternative to renewed attack. Crassus distrusted the invitation and initially resisted leaving the protection of his remaining soldiers. The troops, exhausted and desperate, pressed him to accept terms rather than condemn them to another day of arrows. Crassus descended with a small group of officers to meet Surena between the armies. The Parthians provided a horse, disagreement followed, and both groups reached for weapons in the confusion. Crassus and the officers beside him were killed, whether by design from the beginning or during a meeting that spiraled out of control. Surena sent Crassus's head and hand to King Orodes, who was celebrating in Armenia when the trophies arrived. The captured legionary eagles became symbols of a humiliation Rome would remember long after the battlefield survivors were gone. Thousands of prisoners were marched east, absorbed into Parthian territory, and largely disappeared from reliable historical record. In 20 BC, Augustus recovered the lost standards through diplomacy, presenting negotiation as if it were a military victory. Ancient tradition says Orodes later executed Surena, perhaps fearing the prestige of the young commander who had saved his kingdom. Carrhae endured because Surena made distance a weapon, ammunition a strategy, and Roman courage an engine that pulled men deeper into defeat.